Welcome to this ThinkSmallCell webinar, Small Cell Analyst Forecast Shootout, where we look at the various analyst forecasts for femtocells and small cells for the years ahead and try and understand why they differ. I'm joined today by three leading industry analysts in this sector: Dimitris Mavrakis, Principal Analyst at Informa Media and Telecom; Joe Madden, Founder and Principal Analyst at Mobile Experts; and Caroline Gabriel, the Research Director at Rethink Research. Now, our structure of our webinar today is that first I'll give a short introduction that will just look at the different classifications and terminology we use for small cells and femtocells, so we're all talking about the same thing. And then I'll hand over to each of the three analysts in turn to present their findings and the reasoning behind it. We'll have a quick poll with the audience to see whether you agree or what your forecast is, and then move into a question and answer session. So please feel free to submit questions through the webinar system at any time during the event. So just quickly before I introduce Dimitris as our first analyst, I'd just like to recap some of the terminology that we use and outline one or two of the reasons why these figures might be so different. The first thing is to classify the different types of femtocells and small cells that we have. The residential small cells, or femtocells as they have been called, are very much the larger volume, the significant proportion of the forecasts. And that original technology has expanded now to cover the office business environment in what's called the enterprise. More recently, it's been looked as a capacity solution in urban areas, which is typically called the metro cell. And there's also a rural element where small cells have a part to play in both developed and developing countries in connecting the unconnected and off-grid parts of the world. But in terms of the terminology of small cells, I've included all of these types, but that's not the case with every analyst or every operator. Sometimes people differentiate between femtocells, the residential small cells, and other types, as you see here. And so when we see numbers forecast, they might split those into the different categories. So looking ahead, why are these analysts going to come up with such different numbers? We've seen Informa latest quarterly forecast something like 91 million total small cells by the end of 2016, and that compares with figures that I've taken from a graph from Mobile Experts that looks to me like it's maybe only a tenth of that. There must be some reason for these wider differences, and that's why the experts today will hopefully explain some of these assumptions. A second point is that the forecast seems to have been shifting. If we look back a few years, there were reports that said the hockey stick growth is going to happen in a year or two, but it continues to seem to be deferred. A third point is the relationship between volume and revenue, and I think it's quite important to recognize that the residential femtocells are really intended to be relatively low cost, perhaps $100 price point, whereas a metro cell might be 10 times or 20 times that or more. And so the balance between volume and revenue isn't so clear. And although there's a smaller number of non-residential femtocells, we could be talking more in terms of the revenue for that small proportion. And last but not least, we saw in a recent report from another analyst in the last few weeks that Samsung is reported to be both number one in shipments in terms of number of small cells sold and number one in revenue. And that seems to be a bit of a surprise when there's so many other players and other technologies in the mix today. So with that brief introduction, I'd now like to hand over to Dimitris Mavrakis, to talk us through both his forecast and the underlying reasons behind them. So over to you, Dimitris.
Thanks, David. Thanks for the introduction. One thing to say before going into the numbers is that indeed we see a lot of fragmentation in terms of definitions for small cells. Informa, for once, we include femtocells in the broader small cell ecosystem. So small cells are defined as from consumer to the carrier grade, which I guess that the biggest small cell is a microcell. Also, another point to say here is that our forecasts are based on a bottom-up approach. So we factor in a lot of parameters, for example, broadband penetration, traffic growth, technology maturity, for example, HSPA, LTE, device availability, and of course, a number of assumptions in order to translate all of these parameters into femtocell shipments and deployments. So starting with the first slide here, these are our consumer primarily. These are our femtocell deployments. Primarily they are consumer, but include enterprise as well, or even some public cases. And as we can see here, this is the lion's share of the 90 million number. We see that North America is leading. It is leading today, and we expect North America to lead throughout the forecast period in terms of deployments, followed by Asia Pacific, which is really a very big market if we factor in the number of subscribers, and of course China Mobile and the Chinese market. And of course Europe, including Western and Eastern Europe. Now we have a lot of activity in consumer femtocells in Europe. So in order to back these numbers up, we have some control points which we can use to validate. Now, I have to say that our numbers overall, they are aggressive. And when we did come up with these numbers, when we did provide these forecasts earlier this year, I believed that the 6 million number that we came up at the end of 2012 would be too aggressive. But it seems like if we look at the control points we have, for example, AT&T and Sprint, according to their press releases, they have more than 1 million consumer femtocells deployed. Vodafone Group discussed that they have 500,000, most of them in the UK, but in other subsidiaries as well. And these are 3 operators. So Vodafone has many subsidiaries, but there are overall 46 deployments. So if Vodafone and the US operators have 2.5 million, then it's not a very big extrapolation that for 6 million. So it may well be that 6 million is happening in the market right now. Next slide, please, David. So the previous slide was about femtocells. This slide is about small cells, which excludes femtocells. So picocells, microcells, and metrocells. Of course, the definitions for those vary, but at Informa, we say that picocells are primarily deployed indoors, microcells are deployed outdoors, and metrocells are a flavor of microcells deployed especially for capacity problems, so in dense urban areas. Now, if we compare these numbers with the consumer femtocells, these are very moderate, these are very low. But of course, if we look at vendor business models and revenues associated with these small cells, it is the carrier grade small cells that will create revenue opportunities for vendors. So although the femtocells the consumer femtocells have the numbers, it is these, the picocells, microcells, and metrocells that have the revenue opportunity and growth in the market. And of course, we expect that microcells will dominate in many areas, in urban areas and rural areas. Next slide, please, David. So the key question, I guess, that I'm here to answer is why we expect that we will see 91 million small cells in the market by 2016. Now, as I said earlier, our forecasts are driven by traffic. So we see huge traffic growth from today until 2016, and also broadband penetration. But a few more factors that are specific to the femtocell value chain. Now, femtocell gateways are already in place in many operators, so that will allow them to grow their deployments without the initial teething problems they were facing. And of course, from now until 2016, our estimates illustrate that broadband penetration will double in most regions. And these are significant numbers, especially in developing markets. Now, a major inhibitor for the growth of consumer femtocells has been the price. So the bill of materials for the customer premise equipment, and that has now dropped. So according to our estimates, it's less than $100, and if there are bigger economies of scale, that will drop more. There are also interesting access points coming in the market. For example, the Vodafone Femto plug, which is that image illustrated there, which in the future is expected to include home plug, a networking protocol which uses the power line, the existing power lines in the home, to network different places, which expands the role of the femto plug into a networking device, which may promote its use. And also being offered as an integrated product, which may include Wi-Fi, IPTV, a DSL modem, a cable modem, and so on. From the operator perspective, we see that customer experience management and service quality management is becoming a lot more important. So operators are looking out to offer a much better service to their consumers, and obviously providing high quality coverage is a major driver. And of course, femtocells can be a key ingredient for this. And the final argument is that in many markets, LTE is expected to use higher frequencies, so perhaps 2.6 gigahertz, and 3.5 is also discussed. And this will cause all sorts of interpenetration problems, where femtocells, consumer femtocells, and enterprise femtocells can help to alleviate. But on the other hand, there is a lot of discussion in the industry whether Wi-Fi, so unlicensed small cells, as some vendors are calling them, will be used for indoor coverage. And it seems that China Mobile is interested to introduce voice over Wi-Fi, not only voice over LTE, which may mean that Wi-Fi may be used for indoor coverage as well. This is a question mark. And of course, many operators believe that public carrier-grade small cells are more important, the picocells, microcells, and metrocells, because they are their deployment, their maintenance, and their support properties are closer to what the operator has deployed so far. So these are two reasons that may skew these forecasts, but we believe in the healthy growth of femtocells that they will be used for improving customer experience in the coming years. And this is the biggest reasons for our aggressive numbers. So David, that concludes my part. I'd be happy to take any questions at the end.
Okay, Thanks very much indeed, Dimitris. As you can see, it's a very difficult number to predict because there's a huge range of factors involved. But now I'd like to move on and introduce Joe Madden from Mobile Experts. If I first of all unmute him, you should be able to hear him. Can you hear me, Joe?
Yes, let's do a quick audio check, David. Can you hear me well?
I can hear you very well. So without further ado, we'll go on to your first slide, which is now showing. So over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. So mobile experts see this market very differently than Informa, and I guess I'd like to illustrate that here. First of all, let me point out that the chart I'm putting up is small cell shipments on an annual shipment basis, whereas the chart that Dimitris showed earlier is a cumulative installed base. So that's a major distinction between these two curves. If I were to add up my numbers to compare to Dimitris' 90 million units, my number by the end of 2016 would come out to 28 million units. So there's about a 3-to-1 difference in our forecasts. And I thought I'd put up this chart to illustrate the breakdown and the reasons why I believe in the lower numbers here. First off, let me begin by explaining I have 3 different kinds of small cells shown in my chart. The black line shows consumer femtocells growing over time. The red line on the bottom is enterprise femtocells. And then I have strong growth in what I call carrier grade small cells, microcells, metrocells, picocells. There are a lot of names for those, but essentially those would be ones deployed by the carriers themselves. And as you can see, they follow different growth curves. My thesis in coming up with the forecast and looking at these different segments is that the market drivers for the consumer femtocell market are very different than the drivers behind the carrier grade market. Essentially, the consumer femtocell idea is driven by an end user that would like better coverage in their home or in their office, whereas in the blue line with the carrier grade small cells, the fundamental driver comes from rising data demand and the need for capacity in the network. From a fundamental point of view, I see the consumer femtocell market as driven by factors that we've actually seen for a long time in the repeater market and in other places where there is, I think, a limited appetite for that sort of device. And in fact, when I look at the shipments, I see kind of a linear growth curve there for the coverage market. As opposed to a geometric growth curve for the rising data demand. As we all know, that's rising about double every year. Now, I wanted to point out, if you see on my chart, there's a little triangle there on 2011. That's at 1.9 million small cell shipments in 2011. That's a prediction that I made in May of 2009. And so I wanted to point out that in May of 2009, I did a study of all the different femtocell field trials that were out there and really dove in with some of the operators to ask the reasons why they were looking at this market and where they were going. And I made a very accurate prediction in May of 2009 as to what I thought would happen in 2011. Now, the numbers for 2012 have in fact turned out to be very disappointing. Whereas we had about 1.8 million actual shipments in 2011, the number for 2012, which ends in a couple weeks, looks to be not much bigger, somewhere in the range of 1.9, maybe 2.0 million for 2012. And so the growth curve has not continued along any kind of geometric scale, and that's why I'm projecting this linear growth curve for the future. Now, to explain how I look at this, maybe it would be useful to introduce Mobile Experts for those who are not familiar with our company. We're a small company, 5 people, based here in the Silicon Valley. And what we do is we go around buy lunch for people at semiconductor companies. And we talk to a lot of semiconductor firms about their shipments, about what they're sampling next year, what they're taping out for the year after that. And we also have an advisory panel of 32 different mobile operators around the world that we talk to about the forecast. So we have an approach that we call top-down and bottom-up, where we take top-down inputs from the operators, and then we circulate with the semiconductor vendors to validate that those features and that required product is actually happening in the R&D lab and being taped out for semiconductor chip products. And by doing that, we get about a 2-year window of excellent visibility on what's coming into the market. And at the same time, we get very good visibility on a quarterly level of what shipments have actually taken place. Now, I'd like to point out that as far as cumulative shipments to date, I think Dimitris and I have almost exactly the same number there. Dimitris talked about 5.5 million units shipped to date, and my number is 5.8 million shipped at the end of 2012. So I think in terms of looking back, our numbers are very, very similar. But the difference is in looking forward, I have different drivers for the consumer market versus the carrier grade market. David, let's jump to the next slide, and I'll show some of the background of why I believe in the future forecast. One of the things that we do here in order to validate our assumptions about future market drivers is that we look at the decision-making process of the mobile operators. In the case of our carrier grade small cell forecast, this is the basis chart that I use in looking at what would drive the operators to go with small cell topology, or possibly with a carrier Wi-Fi topology or a macro base station. And in fact, what we find is that a mixture of those things is really the right answer. Over time, and when we look at this over the long view, we've seen the cost of data capacity drop dramatically. And I put this on a log scale because for GSM it was over $100,000 for every megabits per second of capacity, and we've brought that down sequentially with Edge and UMTS, HSPA, moving into LTE and the macro base stations. We've actually got 2 dots here on the chart for LTE small cells. And looking out through 2016, our expectation is that there will be some operators that have relatively high-cost backhaul. Maybe they don't have their own fiber network, and they have to use some form of wireless backhaul for their small cells. And so in that case, it could be in the range of $1,500 for every megabits per second of capacity. There are other operators that will have access to inexpensive backhaul, indoors and outdoors. They may have fiber installed or some other inexpensive way to get the backhaul to their core network. And so we think that small cells can drop below $1,000 per megabits per second of capacity, which, as you can see, puts it into the historical line that the operators need to follow in order to continue getting a return on their investment with the end users. Now, one reason that I don't have numbers in the 80-90 million range for these carrier grade small cells is that carrier Wi-Fi is also a very inexpensive option. And I think for a lot of the indoor traffic, as we know, 80% of the traffic now is indoors. Wi-Fi has become an inexpensive and a desired technique for the operators to use to address those applications. So we've really segmented the market into areas where a macro system is desirable in cases of high mobility. In cases where it's very high density, the LTE HetNet is going to be a really excellent way to address that density. And for indoor applications with hotspots, I think carrier Wi-Fi will be an excellent approach. So looking at those different segments and breaking the available market into those 3 pieces, we've arrived at a forecast in the few millions of units for the carrier grade small cells. In the end, I think backhaul costs and new spectrum and LTE rollouts will dictate just how quickly that happens. Okay, so that's our overview. The overall methodology is a top-down versus bottom-up approach with validation using economic analysis. I'll turn it back to you, David.
Okay, thanks very much indeed, Joe. And I guess I just point out that top right-hand corner of the chart that says that these costs that you've shown on this slide are the total costs over 8 years, and they're not, the cost of an individual femtocell or small cell, for example.
Exactly.
Okay, with that, I'd now like to hand over to our third analyst on the show today, and that's Caroline Gabriel, who's Research Director at Rethink Research. So again, without further ado, over to you.
Thank you, David. For those who don't know me, I'm the Research Director at Rethink Research based in London. Our method is probably a little closer to Joe's, I guess. We take primarily a top-down approach to our research. We have a research base of about 100 operators who we poll regularly, both on their network plans and their business models, and small cells has been a key part of that activity over the last 3 years. So that's the basis of the figures that I'm sharing today. We divide small cells between private cells and public access cells rather than by size. We can drill down into size, of course, but for the purpose of today, I'm just splitting them as private, which will, of course, be mainly residential, and the public access cells I'll come on to in the next slide. I would say that in general, we're probably less aggressive than the average analyst out there about domestic femtocells, and rather more aggressive than the industry norm about public access, and particularly carrier small cells or metro cells. That's partly because of the relationships of those two categories to Wi-Fi. Although I think the industry has certainly got well past the idea that Wi-Fi and cellular are an either-or. There's not a kind of war going on anymore, and in most cases virtually all carriers will use a combination of the two. But however, we think the availability and the usability of Wi-Fi has a direct influence on the scale of uptake of cellular small cells. So in the home, we think the presence of Wi-Fi means there's a lot less need than we once saw for the cellular femtocell. By contrast, we think that carrier Wi-Fi will have severe limitations in the public access arena, and therefore the requirements for the cellular small cell will be accelerated. So that's a little background to the thinking. Looking at the first slide, these are private small cells, so as I said, overwhelmingly dominated by the domestic cells, but also some in there for enterprise. Our number cumulatively is 53 million, the end of 2016, so I think somewhat in line, well, probably between the two analysts that we've already heard. However, our starting point number, the forecast for this year, is 5.2 million, so extremely close, a little bit below, but I think we're all sort of at the same starting point. It's just where it goes from there, where we differ. We see growth somewhat below expectations that we had and many others had 2 years ago. That's partly because I think the sector has got to consumer grade economics more slowly than many had hoped, so the pricing is not quite as low as thought. Femtocells have not yet become integrated into other devices to any great degree, and we believe that that is an absolutely key driver of mass uptake, the point at which users get a femtocell without actively knowing they're getting one, as many of us have Wi-Fi. The other reason why we've become more conservative over the years is that we think the user proposition has remained a lot less compelling than in theory it could have been. That's partly been mistakes by operators, particularly, in our opinion, operators who tried to get revenue from femtocells rather than just seeing them as a way to retain or even attract customers. As the people before me have said also, the proposition really has mainly been to improve coverage and signal quality within the home. That's very important for user satisfaction and a good reason on its own to invest in femtocells, but it doesn't generate a huge amount of additional revenue. And of course, in vast areas of the market, it's not really a significant user consideration. Meanwhile, if users are looking for capacity indoors, increasingly they will turn to Wi-Fi, and increasingly without even having to make that conscious decision, because the smartphone is becoming more capable of skipping between the two connections very, very seamlessly. And of course, that experience is going to improve as we go forward. So we see that the residential femtocell and even to some extent the enterprise femtocell have become part of the operator's toolkit, very useful for improving the overall customer experience and not losing customers who are annoyed by their signal quality, but it's not disruptive. Many of the promises that seem to offer something more creative, such as femtocell-based applications, remain very immature. Operators don't see a way to generate an awful lot of incremental revenue based on installation of femtocells. Where we do think they have been disruptive is in supply chain assumptions. A lot of what's been learned about integration and creating a consumer-grade 3G or 4G product is now filtering its way into the carrier-grade equipment market. I think it's been extremely interesting from that point of view, but that, of course, doesn't drive sales in itself. We do think that there will be something of a leap after 2013. We see very steady growth in unit terms up to that point, and then a slowdown after that. After 2015, we think we almost get to the point with domestic femtocells where operators who are going to deploy them have done so, and it becomes quite a slow additional market after that. At that point, we do believe femtocells will be heavily integrated into other kinds of equipment as well. So the operator concentration on the business model will be fading. They will have other ways of delivering indoor applications by that point. David's already gone to my next slide. I don't know if that's a hint to hurry up, but anyway, I'll come on to it myself. This is looking at the public small cells, and to be honest, this is an area where at Rethink we have probably done a lot more detailed research than on the residential side, because we tend to be looking at carrier business models, and these metro cells we believe will have a disruptive effect on the business case going forward. Of course, we've all heard the reasons why operators are so interested in metro cells, the huge race for capacity in the urban areas, and to some extent, of course, as David mentioned earlier, there's a rural play for the small cells too, in getting coverage to outlying areas at low cost. And again, that brings in that point I made earlier of bringing the cost assumptions of the femtocell market, of the consumer electronics market, right out into the main carrier network. So that's very important. We do think there is going to be increasing integration of Wi-Fi and cellular into the same small cells over time, but we think that's something the operators are massively interested in, but we think there's going to be a big gap between how quickly they think that equipment ought to be available and when it will be usable for technical reasons and of course spectrum and interference reasons as well. So while we wait for that perfect HETnet where Wi-Fi and LTE sort of coexist as a seamless pool, and we think that's a few years of waiting. In contrast to the home market, we do think that the primary way that operators will add meaningful capacity, the kind of capacity that will generate premium revenues and high quality of service, will be relying on cellular small cells. Wi-Fi, in our opinion, will remain much more a best effort offload sort of solution for several years, which will mean it's not enough for most carriers on its own. They will need the cellular capacity as well, hence our quite aggressive forecasts once we get past 2014. Low at the moment. This is a slightly confusing graph because the small cell sales are cumulative, whereas the contrast with traditional macro cells, those are actually annual figures. But the message is clear. Traditional base stations stagnate in numbers. Small cells rise pretty quickly between 2014 and 2017 to top 10 million installed, deployed by 2017. A couple of points to make here. Part of the reason why we see quite a sharp uptake in volume terms at the end of this forecast period, and we believe that will continue on after 2017, is the rapid accelerated adoption of LTE Advanced, which should make deploying large-scale small cell networks a lot easier, a lot more economic for some of the carriers that don't want to invest the huge sums into proprietary solutions and software that some of the front runners, in Japan, etc., have done. And also point out the huge importance of indoor cells. We constantly hear about the race for lampposts and outdoor capacity, and of course that's important, but most heavy-duty mobile data usage does go on inside. And that's partly why we have a big forecast on this, that we believe the public access indoor cell will be a very significant way to deliver mobile capacity, and will often be owned or managed by a non-traditional operator. So we see a lot of role for MVNOs and new entrants to the market, and particularly wireline providers and venue owners and so on, who will actually be able to generate revenue from this. However, and I'm echoing here some of the points that Dimitris made at the beginning, it's a very early stage market. Our forecasts are largely based on what operators are projecting and budgeting for, but we know that there are many factors that can change what an operator actually does compared to what they put in their plan. Although we do sanity check the forecasts we get from them against general industry trends, chip availability and other factors. But even with that, we think because the market is so mature, there is a significant risk factor in the forecast, as much as it could be as much as 35% below what we're forecasting, if we get a combination of certain factors that take place. Standards, if the standards for instance, for the small cell layer interacting with the macro layer, significantly more sophisticated standards required there. That could be a very limiting factor that could push out mass deployment for a couple more years. The backhaul, others have mentioned, of course has to be addressed and is really in the early stages of operators doing that. And the supply chain in general, will costs come down enough? Will these integrated cells be sufficiently reliable? So I think our forecast is likely, if we prove somewhat wrong, it'll probably be down rather than up. But at the moment, based on what the operators are thinking and planning and the sort of capacity they believe that they have to deliver, excluding Wi-Fi, that's what we're projecting going forward in the public access area. So I will hand back to David.
Thanks very much, Caroline. I think you'll all agree that we've heard some very good reasoning and arguments about these forecasts. And it was quite interesting to hear the different sources from the supply chain, from the operator forecasts, and the wider macro environmental aspects all filtering in. So what we're going to do now is ask the audience and see, first of all, how many small cells do you think are currently deployed? And you should see on your screen a choice coming up between a range of less than 4 up to more than 8 million. And it'd be interesting to see whether you agree with the analysts that are broadly aligned somewhere between 5 and 6 million at the moment. So just while you quickly vote on that, I'll then introduce a second poll where we'll ask you how many you think are going to be deployed at the end of 2016. And I'll just recap the figures on the doors from our analysts today. We had 28 million, 53 million from Caroline, and 90 million from Dimitris. And we'll see whether what the audience view is on that. So I think most people have voted, so I'll just close this first poll. And you should see on your screens the results now. So as you can see, the majority believe it's somewhere between 4 and 6 million, about 56% of our audience. Over 10% believe it's more than 6 million, and about a third are more skeptical and think it's less than that. So I'd just like to ask a second poll question now, which is related to how many small cells you believe will be deployed at the end of 2016. So that's shipped, installed, and deployed. Again, you've heard figures from about 28 million, up to 90 million forecast between the different analysts today. So let's just see what we think about that. And most people voting here, which is very good. I think we're just about done. So oh, I've got one or two more. So if you haven't voted, press the button right now, and I'll close that in 5 seconds. That's just giving you a minute. There we go. Right. So you should be able to see the results on your screen now. And I have to say that the audience is a lot more skeptical than some of our analysts, with 44%, as you can see, in the range 20 to 40 million. More than a third looking more optimistically at 40 to 60 million, and then about 20% predicting 60 or more. So that's perhaps a more cautious view than some of the analyst forecasts that we've seen, but it's a very difficult figure to predict. So with that, I'd like to move on, if I may, and just ask some questions. You are able to ask questions yourself from the floor, and I've got quite a few to work through. But let me just start by putting to the audience first, the analysts first. Why have the previous forecast numbers failed to materialize? In other words, there's been a delay before the. If we look a few years ago, we were forecasting quite significant numbers. And what makes these latest forecasts more credible? So if I could first ask Dimitris for his comment on that, and then I'll ask the other panelists if they have something to say. Dimitris?
So the reasoning behind the maturity of the value chain is, first of all, technology. The underlying technology for the femtocell access points has been immature. So after IUH was standardized, at least it took at least another year for deployments to reach market. And of course, there have been many teething problems and operator skepticism about the performance of femtocells and the ability to coexist with macrocells, how the network would behave if there were thousands of femtocells deployed. But the initial deployments have provided a reasonable amount of feedback for operators. So as I said, we did think earlier this year that the 6 million number would be too aggressive for the end of this year, but it seems that operator deployments have progressed well above the 1 million mark. So I think that overall we are set for healthy growth. I think it has been technology maturity that has hindered, and of course the cost of the femtocell access points that has hindered the mass market growth of consumer femtocells.
Thank you. And any quick comment from you, Joe?
Yes, thank you, David. I think the technical issues are important because they illustrate, the mind of the mobile operator. In the case of consumer femtocells, the market really needed the mobile operator to push those products toward their end users. Otherwise, end users would never be aware that this sort of product exists. And in fact, today, most end user consumers are not aware that this kind of a product is out there and are not seeking that product. It's in many cases used as a problem solver type of a product. In fact, if you're a high ARPU user that has poor coverage at home, often some of the operators now have a protocol that they follow where they may offer you a free femtocell if you're above a certain level of ARPU and you live in a certain location that doesn't cause interference for your neighbors. So I think the operators have now chosen to put the consumer femtocell into a bucket where it's a defensive strategy to try to protect themselves against churn. And what we needed for that, the bigger numbers to be realized would be for the operators to take a more offensive strategy and to try to really push these femtocells out to the world.
Thanks, Joe. Any quick comment, Caroline?
Just a quick one. I think there's always an element of the markets getting overexcited because of the actions of a few operators, but early adopters are by their nature atypical and tend not to use standards. They'll invest huge sums in their own approach. So I think we saw the US and Japan and so on, a few flagship operators with very large early deployments. And in a sense, that there's always then that lag before there are the kind of volume economics and standards for everyone else to follow suit. And I think that very much skews everyone's early forecasts, because you have a few very large but atypical rollouts going on, and there's a sort of assumption everyone else will follow, but in fact there's a big gap.
Thanks. So if we quickly move on, I know we haven't got time for too many questions, but one is related to integrated femtocell and Wi-Fi devices, and what are the key technical and business challenges for those? So perhaps if I ask Joe first, the question specifically is, what is the forecast for integrated femtocell and Wi-Fi devices, and what are the key technical and business challenges? Joe?
Okay. Yeah, we do have a high degree of adoption in our forecast for integrated Wi-Fi and small cells, and that happens in multiple different categories of small cells in our forecast. And it's clear that adding Wi-Fi to the box is a very inexpensive thing to do at a semiconductor level, at a hardware level. One thing that still needs to happen is we need closer integration than that, where we have a software level and a system level of integration where intelligent handovers are possible, where the Wi-Fi and the license band cellular can cooperate more closely, and I think a lot of that is underway. So as we look through the numbers that I presented earlier, we would predict that more than half of those would be integrated with Wi-Fi over time.
And any other comment from you, Caroline, on that one?
I'd agree with what Joe said. I think perhaps the business challenge is going to be, certainly in public access, is going to be who owns all these cells that have all these integrated connections. And I think we're seeing a lot of debate about, will they be hosted, will they belong to the broadband carriers, will the mobile operators directly control them? And the more connections and spectrum you put into these boxes, I think the more those debates will rage.
Thanks. Dimitris, any quick point on that one?
I would say that the value proposition of an integrated Wi-Fi and cellular box is perhaps a little bit more difficult than a standalone femtocells, because the value proposition is tied with a hybrid operator, one that owns fixed and mobile assets. So I would say that indeed it's a very interesting market for the operators that have both assets, but somewhat more limited rather than the mobile-only space. And even then, a hybrid operator may choose to deploy femto-only boxes rather than integrated. It really depends on the business case. For example, SFR is really successful. Well, they have deployed a hybrid, a box that includes both. but I would say that it is a more limited value proposition compared to standalone.
Okay, that's clear. An interesting question here from another viewer who's asking if you could comment on the role of small cells for VoLTE and RCS. So VoLTE is voice over LTE and RCS is rich communication services. What role do small cells have for those features? Caroline, have you got a view on that?
Yeah, that's an interesting one, and we've just started seeing the industry talk about those, haven't we? I think we saw SK Telesys announcing a small cell with VoLTE just this week. So I think it's it's very early stage, but very interesting. I would say that the sort of obvious area where the small cell can add to the proposition behind RCS is in that personalization area and being able to have sort of services, messaging and communication services that almost follow the user around and know their preferences according to where they are. And so I would say there's a good degree of opportunity for operators to add personalized and localized services into their RCS offerings. I would say it's more relevant to broader RCS rather than specifically to VoLTE. But see some of the capabilities that, for instance, Microsoft has put into some of its enterprise unified messaging, seeing that sort of thing coming into cellular messaging and rich communications as a differentiation from over the top. So without being an expert in that area at all, that's where I would see the main relevance to be.
Thanks, Caroline. It is an unusual question, not seen that come up before. Dimitris, would you have any comment on that?
Yes. Well, intrinsically, I would say that the decision to deploy small cells and VoLTE, the two decisions are not in any way connected, because I believe that they are being deployed by different parts of the mobile operator business. However, in my opinion, it really depends on the voice over LTE strategy. So if operators are really bullish about packet-based voice, VoLTE, then they will want to offer the same experience indoors. And small cells may have a role to play. Now, as I mentioned earlier, China Mobile announced that they will only do VoLTE if handsets support voice over Wi-Fi as well. So packet-based voice over Wi-Fi. And that may be a very important element to the indoor coverage strategy. I don't expect that there would be any business decision driving consumer small cell deployment by VoLTE or RCS. I would see perhaps in best case they would be individually deployed.
Okay. No, thanks very much, Dimitris. Joe, do you have any comment on that one?
I think just a technical comment on the combination of VoLTE and small cells is that it increases the stakes. When we look at LTE small cells now, we think of them in terms of nomadic services and data services on a tablet or on a handset where you're loading a few packets and then you've got what you need, and then you might move on to the next small cell and get additional packets there. But the continuity is not as much a factor as we've seen in the voice market. As we go to VoLTE, I think the continuity and the mobility of forwarding those packets in LTE is going to become more critical. So we'll see different KPIs, different key process indicators popping up as important again in LTE, whereas they may have taken a second tier status to date.
Thanks very much, Joe. I think we've probably only got time for one last question. And one of our viewers is asking really whether operators with combined wireline and wireless do have a long-term advantage. I know in the past we've talked about convergence, and then there's the industry is really almost able to operate with very strong mobile-only operators. But with this large deployment of both residential and public access small cells, will these combined wireline and wireless operators have that long-term advantage for the future? Could I ask Dimitris that question first, please?
That's an interesting one. Well, it seems that when the mobile industry took off, especially data services, it seemed that the netheads, so the mobile operator people, were the cool guys. But now it seems that the fixed guys are cooler, because they've tackled a lot of problems that the mobile operators are facing now. For example, CDNs and content strategies and so on. So I would say that yes, perhaps there is a strategic advantage to having a small cell strategy. There are many factors that can tie into this. For example, having more visibility of what subscribers do and being to mine this data for personalized services and so on. But again, there are many questions about the cultural impact of this. For example, is the fixed and mobile side, can they cooperate to offer a converged strategy? And on the other hand, we've seen all sorts of previous industry initiatives. For example, seamless mobility, convergence, fixed mobile convergence, which haven't really taken off, primarily because there has been no big revenue opportunity or a value proposition for the end user. So it really remains to be seen whether operators can really benefit from this.
Thanks very much, Dimitris. And with just a short time left, could I ask Joe any quick view on that one?
Yeah, let me try to do it quickly. I think there are many different advantages to being both a wireline and wireless operator, and we've seen that for many years in dealing with the customers. What I wanted to address is the relevance to small cells, and in my chart I showed different cost points for high cost of backhaul versus low cost of backhaul in the ROI for a small cell, and I think that's going to be a real advantage for those operators that have fiber available in buildings and can access that fiber inexpensively. That'll give them an advantage in providing that indoor coverage very inexpensively.
Thanks very much, Joe. Caroline, any quick comment on that one?
Absolutely echoing Joe. Backhaul, a huge advantage, and also the wireline operators suddenly get a sort of an opportunity to enter the territory the mobile operators have been cool for, as Dimitris said, at relatively low cost. So I think they will win in both directions.
Good. That's an interesting one. We have many more questions than I'm afraid we have time available to cover them. So it's at this point that I have to thank our panelists today. We had Dimitris Mavrakis from Informa Media and Telecoms, Joe Madden from Modal Experts, and Caroline Gabriel from Rethink Research. And I hope all of you found that a worthwhile and interesting session. If you would like some more information about small cells generally, then of course ThinkSmallCell.com is the place to go, and you could sign up for our free monthly newsletters. You can view a number of webinars, and this one will also be recorded and available on demand after today. So if you found it useful, you could recommend your colleagues to watch that. And we also have a page with a number of recent analyst reports that you can go to, and pointers to a variety of publications there. There are other small cell forum reports. The one I mentioned earlier that Dimitris provides for the small cell forum is available free to download from their white paper section there. And the links that you can see on the screen now are for the various companies that our analysts work for today. So with that, Again, thank you all very much for viewing. Thank to our panelists for taking part. And with that, I'll close the session. Thank you very much indeed.